January 1870. The blizzard howled across the Arizona plains like a wounded beast, its icy breath turning the world white and hostile. The rickety wagon creaked and shuddered, each gust of wind threatening to tear it apart. Inside, huddled beneath threadbare blankets that did little to ward off the penetrating cold, Abigail Morgan clutched her two children to her chest. "Mama, I'm so cold," Emma whispered, her small body trembling against Abigail's side. At 5 years old, her daughter's face had grown too thin, too serious for a child who should be filled with laughter. "I know, sweet one," Abigail murmured, pulling the blanket tighter around Emma's shoulders. "Just a little longer. We'll find shelter soon." She felt Noah's small hand slip into hers. 6 years old and already trying to be the man of the family. His solemn eyes, so like his father's, searched her face for reassurance she wasn't sure she could provide. "The wheel won't last much longer, will it?" he asked quietly. Abigail swallowed hard. The cracked wagon wheel had been wobbling for miles, the sound growing worse with each passing hour. The ancient mare pulling them forward was nearly spent, her breath coming in labored clouds that dissipated in the swirling snow. "We'll manage," she said, the words hollow even to her own ears. The wagon lurched, suddenly tilting at a sickening angle. A crack split the air louder than the howling wind. Abigail's heart plummeted as the wagon settled awkwardly into the snow. The wheel had finally given way. "Stay here," she instructed, tucking the blanket around her children. "I need to check how bad it is." Stepping out into the storm was like plunging into an icy river. The wind cut through her worn coat and snow immediately clung to her eyelashes, making it difficult to see. Abigail braced herself against the biting, cold one hand, instinctively cradling her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant, she had no business traveling in such conditions, but necessity had driven them from their home after Thomas's death. The wheel was beyond repair, splintered beyond recognition. Abigail pressed her lips together to keep from crying out in despair. They were miles from the nearest settlement, with night falling fast and the temperature dropping by the minute. "God, if you're still listening," she whispered, her breath forming ghostly shapes in the frigid air. "I need you now. We need you." But no answer came. Only the howling wind growing fiercer as darkness descended. Just as it had been silent 2 months ago, when Thomas's fever had taken him, leaving her with two children, another on the way, and a mountain of debt that had forced her to flee in the night. Turning back to the wagon, Abigail froze. A dark silhouette had materialized from the swirling snow, a figure so tall and broad it seemed more bear than man. He stood motionless, observing her, a rifle cradled in his arms. Fear seized her throat, but she stepped protectively in front of the wagon where her children huddled. "We want no trouble," she called out, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The figure moved closer, his features slowly becoming visible through the curtain of snow. A man towering well over 6 feet, with shoulders like an ox and a face half hidden by a wild beard. But it was his eyes that held Abigail's attention, deep set and weary, the color of steel in winter light. A jagged scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his mouth in a permanent half-grimace. "You're a long way from anywhere," the man said, his voice a low rumble that somehow carried over the wind. "Wheel's done for." "I'm aware," Abigail replied, lifting her chin. "We'll manage." The man's gaze swept over her, taking in her condition, then moved to the wagon where two small faces peered out fearfully. His expression remained impassive, but something flickered in those gray eyes, recognition perhaps of their desperate situation. "Night's coming, storm's getting worse." He gestured to the north with a gloved hand. "My place is a mile that way. You won't survive out here." Abigail hesitated. The stranger was right, they wouldn't last the night in the broken wagon. But following an unknown man into the wilderness went against every instinct of self-preservation. As if reading her thoughts, he added, "Name's Emmett Stone. I've got a roof and a fire, your choice, ma'am, but choose quick." A violent gust of wind rocked the wagon, making Emma cry out in fear. That decided it. Pride and caution would have to yield to necessity. "Abigail Morgan," she said, "these are my children, Noah and Emma." Emmett nodded once, then moved toward the wagon. "Grab what you need. Can't save the rest tonight." With efficient movements that spoke of years of hard living, he helped Abigail gather their meager belongings. Then, to her surprise, he lifted both children in his arms as if they weighed nothing. "Follow close," he instructed. "Easy to get lost in this." They trudged through deepening snow, the wind at their backs now pushing them forward. Abigail's legs ached with each step and her back throbbed painfully. The baby within her shifted restlessly as if sensing her distress. She focused on Emmett's broad back ahead of her, on the small faces of her children peeking over his shoulders, and forced herself to keep moving. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, a dark shape loomed ahead, a small, sturdy cabin nestled against a rocky hillside. A barn stood nearby, and a corral where shadows moved horses or cattle seeking shelter from the storm. Emmett shouldered open the cabin door, ducking his head as he entered. Heat enveloped them immediately, blessed glorious heat from a fireplace where flames danced merrily. The cabin was simple but solid, one main room with a wooden table and chairs, a cooking area, and a stone fireplace. A narrow doorway led to what appeared to be a small bedroom. "Set them down by the fire," Abigail said, following him inside and closing the door against the howling wind. Emmett gently lowered the children onto a rug before the hearth. They huddled there wide-eyed and silent, watching the stranger who had rescued them. "Thank you," Abigail said, the words inadequate for the relief she felt at being out of the storm. "We would have frozen out there." Emmett merely nodded, moving to the cooking area where a pot simmered on a small stove. "Stew's near done, not fancy, but it's hot." While he busied himself with the meal, Abigail helped her children out of their snow-crusted outer clothes, rubbing warmth back into their tiny fingers and toes. They were painfully thin, she realized anew. Weeks of meager rations had taken their toll. "You folks headed somewhere particular?" Emmett asked as he ladled stew into wooden bowls. "Tucson," Abigail replied. "I have a distant cousin there who might take us in." It was a half-truth. The cousin existed, but whether she would welcome them was another matter entirely. Emmett set the bowls on the table, then cut thick slices from a loaf of bread. "Eat," he said simply. The stew was plain but hearty venison with root vegetables and wild herbs. Abigail watched as her children ate with barely restrained desperation, their small hands clutching the spoons tightly. Noah remembered his manners enough to murmur a thank you, but Emma was too hungry to pause. Emmett ate in silence, his movements methodical, his eyes occasionally drifting to the windows where snow continued to pile against the glass. When the meal was finished, he rose without a word and disappeared through the doorway to the bedroom. He returned moments later with several blankets and a pillow. "You and the little ones take the bed," he said, gesturing toward the bedroom. "I'll sleep out here." "We couldn't possibly," Abigail began. "You can and will." Emmett cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "Woman in your condition needs proper rest. Bed's nothing special, but it's better than the floor." He turned away, arranging the blankets on a bench near the fire, clearly considering the matter settled. Abigail led her exhausted children to the small bedroom. A simple bed with a straw mattress took up most of the space, but it looked clean and warm. She helped Noah and Emma out of their clothes and into the bed, tucking the covers around them securely. "Are we staying here, Mama?" Emma whispered, her eyelids already drooping with sleep. "Just until the storm passes, sweet one," Abigail replied, smoothing her daughter's hair back from her forehead. "I like it here," Noah murmured. "It's warm, and Mr. Stone has food." Abigail's heart clenched at the simple assessment. How low they had fallen, that warmth, and a single meal could seem like luxury to her children. "Rest now," she said, kissing each of their foreheads. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." She returned to the main room to find Emmett stoking the fire, his massive frame silhouetted against the flames. He straightened when he heard her approach. "I wanted to thank you properly," Abigail said. "You saved our lives tonight." Emmett shrugged, as if plucking a woman and two children from certain death were a trivial matter. "Storm caught you unprepared. Happens. Nevertheless, we're grateful." She hesitated, then added, "We won't impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary. Once the storm breaks—" "Storm might last days," Emmett interrupted, "and after that the snow will be deep. That wagon of yours is finished. Tucson's more than 100 miles south." Reality settled over Abigail like a weight. He was right, of course. They were stranded at the mercy of a stranger's goodwill in the middle of nowhere. "I'll pay you for your trouble when we reach Tucson," she said, her pride still intact despite everything. "My cousin will—" "Don't need payment," Emmett said, cutting her off again. He turned fully to face her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "But I do have a proposition for you, Mrs. Morgan." Something in his tone made Abigail tense. "What sort of proposition?" Emmett met her gaze directly, his gray eyes hard as flint. "I'll raise your children, and you'll give me more." The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their bluntness. For a moment, Abigail thought she had misheard or misunderstood. "I beg your pardon." She managed her voice barely above a whisper. "It's straightforward enough," Emmett continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "You need somewhere for those kids to grow up safe. Food on the table, roof overhead. I've got all that. What I don't have is family. You'd provide that." Abigail took a step back instinctively, placing a protective hand over her belly. "You can't be serious." "Entirely serious." He gestured around the cabin. "This place needs a woman's touch. Land needs working. Children need raising. Makes sense all around." "Makes sense?" Abigail repeated, indignation rising through her shock. "Mr. Stone, I am not some broodmare to be bargained for. I have my dignity, my self-respect." "Dignity won't feed your children," Emmett interrupted, his voice still calm. "Self-respect won't keep them warm. I'm offering a practical solution to your situation. By suggesting but what become your wife, bear your children, based on a single meal and a night's shelter." Abigail's voice rose despite her effort to remain composed. "I don't know you. You don't know me. This is absurd." "Know enough," Emmett replied. "Know you're alone with two young ones and another coming. Know whatever you're running from must be bad to have you traveling in your condition during winter. Know your chances of making it to Tucson alive are slim to none." Each point struck Abigail like a physical blow because she couldn't deny the truth in them. She was desperate with few options and fewer resources. "And what would this arrangement entail exactly?" she asked, hating herself for even considering it, but unable to dismiss it outright. "Marriage in name at first," Emmett said. "You'd have your own room, lock on the door, no demands beyond keeping house and raising the children. After the baby comes and you've healed, we'd share a bed. Try for more children." The clinical way he outlined the arrangement made Abigail's cheeks burn with humiliation. Yet beneath her indignation, a treacherous voice whispered that this might be her only chance to provide for her children. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Emmett shrugged again. "You're free to go when the weather clears. I won't keep you against your will, but the offer stands." Abigail turned away, unable to bear his steady gaze any longer. Through the window, she could see nothing but swirling white. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Take it," Emmett replied. "But don't take too long. Winter's just beginning and decisions get harder when food gets scarce." With that ominous reminder, he stretched out on the bench by the fire, pulled a blanket over himself, and closed his eyes, effectively ending the conversation. Abigail returned to the bedroom, her mind reeling. She slipped into bed beside her sleeping children, drawing comfort from their warm, small bodies pressed against hers. Emma murmured something in her sleep and nestled closer. Noah's breathing was deep and even more peaceful than it had been in weeks. What kind of mother would consider such an arrangement? What kind of woman would agree to marry a stranger to bear his children in exchange for security? Yet what kind of mother would reject security for her children out of pride? Thomas had been dead for barely 2 months. The memory of him was still fresh. His kind eyes, his easy laugh, his boundless optimism that had ultimately led them to ruin. He had borrowed heavily, investing in schemes that never materialized, leaving her with nothing but debts she couldn't pay and creditors at the door. "What should I do, Thomas?" she whispered into the darkness. But as always, since his death, there was no answer. Outside, the blizzard raged on, isolating the small cabin from the rest of the world. Inside, Abigail Morgan lay awake, torn between desperate pragmatism and the last vestiges of her dignity. Morning arrived with blinding brightness as sunlight reflected off the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine white world that glittered like diamonds under the clear blue sky. Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of her children's excited voices. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back: the broken wagon, the stranger's cabin, his impossible proposition. She rose carefully, her back aching from the weight of her advanced pregnancy. The cabin was warmer than she expected, the fire already built up for the day. Through the doorway, she could see Emma and Noah sitting at the table, watching with fascination as Emmett showed them how to whittle simple shapes from pieces of wood. "Hold it away from you," he was saying to Noah, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones. "Always cut away from yourself. That's it." The scene was so unexpectedly domestic that Abigail paused, unsure how to proceed. It was Emmett who noticed her first, his gray eyes flickering up to meet hers. Coffee's hot, he said, nodding toward the pot on the stove. There's bread and preserves for breakfast. Mama, Emma exclaimed, noticing her presence. Mr. Stone is teaching us to make animals from wood. Look. She held up a small, crudely carved shape that might have been a horse or possibly a dog. The pride in her daughter's face made Abigail's heart twist painfully. That's wonderful, Emma, she said, moving to the stove where she poured herself a cup of the strong black coffee. It was a luxury she hadn't tasted in weeks, and the warmth of the mug in her hands was almost as comforting as the first sip. Storms passed, Emmett said, setting down his knife and the piece of wood he'd been demonstrating with. But there's 3 feet of snow on the ground. No traveling for a while. Abigail nodded, understanding the implications. They were still stranded, still dependent on this man's charity or his proposition. I checked on your wagon at first light, he continued. Axles cracked along with the wheel. It won't be going anywhere. I see, Abigail said quietly. Another avenue closed and no other option eliminated. Emmett rose from the table, his height all the more imposing in the confines of the small cabin. Need to tend to the livestock. Children can help if they'd like. Noah and Emma looked to their mother, eyes bright with excitement at the prospect of seeing the animals. Bundle up warmly, Abigail instructed, unable to deny them this simple pleasure. And mind Mr. Stone's instructions. As Emmett helped the children into their coats and boots, Abigail took the opportunity to examine the cabin more carefully in daylight. It was simply furnished but solidly built, the logs carefully fitted to keep out drafts. The few pieces of furniture were handcrafted with obvious skill. A small bookshelf held a surprising number of volumes, their spines worn from use. One book stood apart on a shelf of its own, a large, leather-bound Bible. It looked well used, its edges softened with handling. The sight of it triggered a pang in Abigail's chest. She had been raised in a house of faith, the daughter of a respected preacher whose sermons had drawn crowds from miles around. How far she had fallen from those days of certainty and grace. The door opened and closed as Emmett and the children went out to the barn, leaving Abigail alone with her thoughts. She moved about the cabin, straightening what little needed straightening, familiarizing herself with the layout. The offer Emmett had made still burned in her mind, impossible to ignore, yet difficult to contemplate. A small chest in the corner caught her attention. Unlike the other furniture, which was practical and unadorned, this had been crafted with care, intricate carvings decorating its surface. Curiosity overcame propriety, and Abigail knelt beside it, running her fingers over the detailed work. She didn't open it, that would be an invasion too far, but something about the chest spoke of treasured memories of a past carefully preserved. It made her wonder about the man who had rescued them. Who had Emmett Stone been before he became this solitary figure living alone in the wilderness? The door opened again, admitting a gust of cold air and the sound of childish laughter. Emma burst in first, her cheeks rosy with cold and excitement. Mama, there are horses and cows and chickens, and Mr. Stone let me feed the hens, she exclaimed, her earlier lethargy replaced by vibrant enthusiasm. Noah followed more sedately, but his eyes too were alight with interest. Mr. Stone says I can help collect eggs tomorrow if we're still here, he said, looking at his mother questioningly. Emmett entered last, ducking his head to clear the doorframe. His gaze immediately found Abigail kneeling by the chest, and something flickered in his expression, pain perhaps, or wariness. Abigail rose quickly, embarrassed to be caught examining his possessions. The children seem taken with your animals, she said to bridge the awkward moment. They're good with them, Emmett replied, helping Emma out of her coat. Boy's got a gentle hand, important with livestock. It was the longest assessment she'd heard from him, and Abigail was surprised by the hint of approval in his tone. Noah has always been good with animals, she said. In our old home, he helped care for the neighbor's dog when it had puppies. A ghost of a smile touched Emmett's lips before disappearing again beneath his beard. Good trait in a boy. He moved to the stove, adding wood to the fire beneath it. Thought we'd have venison stew again for midday meal. Got some dried apples for after if the young ones have a sweet tooth. Emma's eyes widened at the mention of sweets. Really apples? Emma, Abigail admonished gently. Mind your manners. Sorry, Mr. Stone, Emma said immediately. Thank you for offering. Emmett nodded in acknowledgement, his expression softening marginally when he looked at the little girl. Why don't you two see if you can find the checkerboard in that trunk by the window? Used to have one somewhere. While the children eagerly investigated the trunk, Emmett moved closer to Abigail, lowering his voice. Have you thought about what I said? Abigail tensed. I have thought of little else, Mr. Stone. And she met his gaze directly. I need to know more before I can consider such a significant arrangement. Why me? Why now? There must be women in the nearest town who would consider your offer without the complication of two children, not their own, and another on the way. Emmett's jaw tightened beneath his beard. I keep to myself. Don't go to town more than necessary. That doesn't answer my question, Abigail pressed. He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her as if weighing what to reveal. Finally, he said, You need help. I need family. Simple as that. But it wasn't simple, and they both knew it. There was more to his proposition than pragmatic mutual benefit, though Abigail couldn't decipher what. I found it, Noah called out, holding up a wooden checkerboard in a small bag that presumably contained the pieces. The conversation was effectively ended as Emmett moved away to show the children how to set up the game. Abigail watched as he patiently explained the rules, his large hands dwarfing the game pieces as he demonstrated possible moves. There was gentleness in those hands despite their size and strength, the same gentleness she had observed as he taught Noah to whittle and helped Emma feed the chickens. Whatever else Emmett Stone might be, he was not unkind to children. The day passed in unexpected domesticity. After the midday meal, which was indeed as hearty as promised, and included the dried apples that made Emma squeal with delight, Emmett brought in more firewood and tended to the animals again. Abigail kept the children occupied with small chores and stories, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in their disrupted lives. As evening approached, Emmett returned from the barn snow clinging to his coat and boots. Storm's coming back, he announced, stamping his feet on the threshold to remove the worst of the snow. Sky's got that look. Abigail moved to the window, seeing the clouds gathering on the horizon. The brief reprieve was ending. They would be snowbound again by morning. Dinner was a quiet affair, the impending storm casting a shadow over the meal. The children, exhausted from a day of excitement and fresh air, could barely keep their eyes open by the time they finished eating. I'll help them to bed, Abigail said, rising from the table. They're nearly asleep where they sit. Emmett nodded, gathering the bowls and spoons. It struck Abigail as oddly domestic, this sharing of tasks that had developed naturally over the course of a single day. After settling the children in the bed, singing a soft lullaby until their breathing deepened into sleep, Abigail returned to find Emmett seated at the table, the Bible open before him. He wasn't reading it, merely staring at the pages as if they might contain answers to unspoken questions. He looked up as she approached, closing the book with careful reverence. They asleep? Yes, Abigail said, taking the seat across from him. They were exhausted. It's been a long time since they've had such freedom to play. Emmett nodded, his fingers still resting on the Bible's worn cover. Good kids, well-mannered. Thank you, Abigail said unexpectedly, touched by the simple compliment. I've tried to raise them right despite everything. A moment of silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable. The wind had picked up outside, whistling around the eaves of the cabin, heralding the approaching storm. May I ask you something, Mr. Stone? Abigail said finally. He inclined his head slightly, waiting. That chest, she gestured toward the carved box she had examined earlier. It's very beautiful. Did you make it? A shadow passed over Emmett's features. No, he said shortly. My wife's father made it for our wedding. The word wife hung in the air, heavy with implication. Abigail had suspected as much, a man his age living alone in a cabin built for a family, but having it confirmed shifted something in her understanding of him. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to pry into painful memories. Emmett's jaw worked beneath his beard as if he were chewing on words he wasn't sure he wanted to release. Finally, he said, Hannah. Her name was Hannah, and our son was Samuel. The past tense told Abigail all she needed to know. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mr. Stone. He nodded once, accepting her condolence with the same stoic restraint he seemed to apply to all emotions. 5 years ago, typhoid. His hand clenched on the Bible. Water dispute with a neighbor. They dammed the creek upstream, forced us to use stagnant pond water. Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The loss of a spouse she understood all too well, but to lose a child too. How old was Samuel? She asked gently. 2. The word came out rough, as if scraped from his throat. Just learning to walk proper. The pain in those simple statements was palpable, all the more affecting for the restraint with which they were delivered. Abigail's heart ached for the man before her, this stranger who had offered them shelter and now revealed the source of his solitude. "Is that why you sleep out here rather than in the bedroom?" she asked, understanding dawning. "Too many memories." Emmett's gaze snapped to hers, surprise evident in his eyes. Then he nodded slowly. "House feels too empty sometimes." Abigail recognized the feeling. After Thomas died, their small home in Denver had seemed cavernous, despite its modest size, the absence of his voice and laughter echoing in every corner. "I understand," she said simply. Emmett studied her for a long moment, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "Your husband. How did he pass fever?" Abigail replied, the words still bitter on her tongue after 2 months. "It came on suddenly and burned through him in days. The doctor said there was nothing to be done but make him comfortable at the end." She didn't mention the debts, the creditors who had circled like vultures before Thomas was even cold in his grave. The man who had attacked her in her own home when she couldn't pay what was owed. Some burdens were still too heavy to share. "Children's father," Emmett said slowly. "He was a good man." The question caught Abigail off guard. Thomas had been charming, ambitious, full of dreams that never quite materialized. He had loved their children in his way, though he had often been absent chasing the next opportunity. Had he been a good man? Yes, in his heart. A good provider. No, despite his best intentions. "He tried to be," she answered honestly. "He loved us, but he wasn't practical. He had grand ideas that rarely came to fruition." Emmett seemed to consider this, his expression thoughtful. "That why you're running debts?" Abigail tensed. "What makes you think I'm running from anything?" "Woman in your condition doesn't travel in winter unless something's chasing her," Emmett said bluntly. "Debts are common enough. Nothing to be ashamed of." The kindness in his assessment loosened something in Abigail's chest. "Yes," she admitted. "Thomas left significant debts. The creditors were insistent." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes, as she remembered the night she had decided to flee. The pounding on the door, the man forcing his way, in his breath reeking of whiskey, as he backed her against the wall and demanding payment in whatever form she could provide. She had struck him with a fire iron and fled with the children that very night, taking only what they could carry. "I had no choice but to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't. I wouldn't." "No need to explain," Emmett interrupted, his tone gruff, but not unkind. "Man should provide for his family, living or dead. Your husband failed in that." The blunt assessment should have offended her, but there was truth in it that Abigail couldn't deny. Thomas had loved them, but love alone couldn't feed children or keep a roof over their heads. "Which brings us back to my proposition," Emmett continued. "I can provide. That's a certainty. This land is good. The livestock healthy. Pantry stays full year-round." Abigail looked up at him, this strange, solemn man who had saved them from the storm and now offered a different kind of salvation. "And what would you expect of me exactly beyond the obvious?" Emmett's expression remained steady. "Keep house. Raise the children yours and any we might have together. Be a partner in building something that will last. And intimacy." Abigail forced herself to ask, heat rising in her cheeks, despite her determination to speak plainly. "Not until you're ready," Emmett said, his gaze direct but not demanding. "After the baby comes and you've healed, you'd have your privacy until then. Your own room with a lock, like I said." The consideration in this detail surprised Abigail. She had expected many things from this gruff mountain of a man, but delicacy regarding her comfort was not among them. "And if it doesn't work," she asked, "if we find we cannot tolerate each other after some time?" Emmett's expression hardened slightly. "Marriage is a covenant, not something to be entered lightly or discarded when inconvenient." The answer revealed more about him than perhaps he intended. This was a man of principles, however rough-hewn they might be. "I need time," Abigail said finally. "This is not a decision to be made in haste." Emmett nodded, accepting this without argument. "Spring's a long way off." "You've got time." He rose from the table, his large frame blocking the lamplight momentarily. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight. Give you and the little ones the cabin to yourselves." "That's not necessary," Abigail protested. Barn's warm enough." Emmett cut her off. "Got a small stove out there for cold nights. You'll be more comfortable without a stranger underfoot." Before she could object further, he had donned his coat and boots and was out the door, a gust of cold air swirling in his wake before the door closed firmly behind him. Abigail sat at the table for a long time after he left, listening to the wind rising outside and the soft breathing of her children in the next room. The Bible still lay where Emmett had left it, its presence a silent witness to their conversation. Almost without conscious thought, she opened it, finding comfort in the familiar passages that had been read to her since childhood. The book fell open naturally to a well-worn page in Psalms. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. How long had it been since she had truly believed that, since the God of her father's sermons had seemed anything but distant and silent in the face of her troubles? Abigail closed the Bible gently, her mind turning over the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this cabin, to this man with his impossible proposition. Was it mere chance that had driven them into the path of the blizzard, broken their wagon wheel, at precisely the moment when Emmett Stone happened to be nearby? Or was it something else, the hand of providence that her father had so often preached about? The wind howled louder, rattling the windows in their frames. The storm was returning as Emmett had predicted, isolating them further from the outside world. Abigail rose and checked that the door was securely latched, then added wood to the fire to keep the cabin warm through the night. As she prepared for bed, moving quietly so as not to wake the children, but Abigail found herself glancing at the carved chest in the corner. What did it contain? Mementos of a life lost, keepsakes of a wife and child taken too soon. She slipped into bed beside her sleeping children, drawing comfort from their warm presence. Emma murmured something in her sleep and nestled closer. Noah's arm flung out his small hand, finding hers in the darkness. Outside, the blizzard raged anew, but inside the sturdy cabin, Abigail Morgan lay awake, considering a future she had never imagined, as the wife of a stranger who offered security at the price of her independence. Was it a bargain worth making? For her children's sake, could she set aside her pride, her lingering grief for Thomas, her fear of binding herself to an unknown man, as sleep finally claimed her? Abigail's last conscious thought was of Emmett's gray eyes, so full of pain and loneliness that mirrored her own. Perhaps that, more than anything, was what made his proposition impossible to dismiss outright. They were two broken people, each carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. The storm lasted 3 days, blanketing the world outside in deeper snow than Abigail had ever seen. During that time, a routine of sorts developed. Emmett continued to sleep in the barn, despite her protests, coming to the cabin at dawn to build up the fire before heading out to tend the livestock. Abigail cooked meals from the well-stocked pantry, kept the cabin tidy, and occupied the children with games and stories. To her surprise, Noah and Emma flourished in this temporary respite from their troubles. Their cheeks filled out as regular meals restored their health. Their eyes brightened with interest as Emmett taught them simple skills: how to whittle wood, how to collect eggs without disturbing the hens, how to identify animal tracks in the snow. On the morning of the 4th day, Abigail woke to sunshine streaming through the window. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Every surface gleamed with pristine snow, and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal ornaments. She found Emmett at the table, poring over a worn map spread before him. He looked up as she entered, nodding in greeting. "Good morning," Abigail said, moving to the stove where coffee already simmered. "The storm has passed, I see." "For now," Emmett agreed. "But February's just starting. Worst of winter's still ahead." He folded the map carefully and set it aside. "Thought I'd check on your wagon today. See what can be salvaged." Abigail poured herself a cup of coffee, warming her hands around the mug. "That's kind of you, but I'm not sure what good it will do. You said yourself the axle was cracked." "Might be some of your belongings worth recovering," Emmett said with a shrug. "Personal things. Items with meaning." The consideration touched Abigail unexpectedly. They had fled Denver with so little, but what they had managed to bring included small treasures: a locket containing locks of the children's baby hair, Thomas's pocket watch, a daguerreotype of her parents. "Thank you," she said simply. "That would mean a great deal." Emmett nodded, rising from the table. "No need for thanks, just practical." As he prepared to leave, bundling up against the cold, Noah emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Martin Stone," he said, his voice still thick with sleep, "can I come with you to check the wagon?" Emmett glanced at Abigail, silently seeking her permission. She hesitated, protective instincts warring with the knowledge that Noah had grown attached to their taciturn host. The snow's very deep, she said doubtfully, and it's terribly cold. Boy needs fresh air, Emmett said. Been cooped up for days. I'll keep him warm enough. Noah looked at her pleadingly, and Abigail found herself relenting. Very well, but bundle up properly. Every button-fastened scarf wrapped tight. While she helped Noah into his coat, making sure he was thoroughly protected from the cold, Emmett rummaged in a trunk near the door. He emerged with a small fur hat that he placed carefully on Noah's head. Rabbit fur, he explained. Warmest there is. Noah's eyes widened with delight as he reached up to touch the soft fur. Is it really for me? For now, Emmett said with a nod. Outgrown it myself some time back. The small joke, the first Abigail had heard from him, startled a laugh from Noah. The sound so rare in recent months warmed Abigail's heart more effectively than the fire ever could. After they had gone tramping through the snow toward where the wagon had been abandoned, Abigail turned her attention to Emma, who was now awake and demanding breakfast. The day passed quietly with Abigail finding unexpected pleasure in simple domestic tasks that had once seemed burdensome. It was late afternoon when Emmett and Noah returned their arms laden with salvaged items from the wagon. Noah's cheeks were red with cold, but his eyes bright with excitement as he recounted their adventure. The wagon was almost completely buried, Mama, he exclaimed. Mr. Stone had to dig through the snow to find it, and there were animal tracks all around. He showed me how to tell deer from rabbit from fox. Emmett set down his burden on the table, a small trunk that contained most of their personal belongings. Boy's a quick study, he said, the barest hint of approval in his tone. Good eye for tracking. Noah beamed at the praise, puffing up with pride. Mr. Stone says maybe I can help him check the trap line tomorrow if it doesn't storm again. Abigail looked at Emmett sharply. Trap line? Just small snares for rabbits, Emmett explained. Nothing dangerous. Part of putting food on the table. Abigail hesitated, torn between protecting her son from the harsh realities of frontier life and acknowledging that such skills might serve him well. We'll see, she said finally. Depends on the weather, as Mr. Stone says. That evening, as they sat around the table for dinner, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The children chattered more freely. Emmett responded with more than monosyllables, and Abigail found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since Thomas fell ill. After the children were indoors, Abigail and Emmett sat by the fire, the comfortable silence broken only by the crackling of flames and the occasional howl of wind outside. I've been thinking about your proposition, Abigail said finally, her voice soft in the dim light. Emmett looked up from the piece of wood he was whittling, his expression guarded. And I have conditions, she said, lifting her chin slightly, if I were to consider it. He set down his knife and wood, giving her his full attention. I'm listening. First, this would be temporary, Abigail began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Just until I can find proper work or my situation improves. I won't be bound to anyone permanently against my will. Emmett's jaw tightened beneath his beard, but he nodded for her to continue. Second, my children are my own to raise as I see fit, she continued. You may offer guidance, but final decisions regarding them rest with me. Fair enough, Emmett said, his voice low. Third, Abigail took a deep breath. I need to know more about you before I commit to anything. Who you were before you came here. Why you live so isolated. What happened with the neighbor who dammed the creek? This last demand caused a visible reaction. Emmett's hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. His gray eyes, reflecting the firelight, seemed to darken with remembered pain. Not much to tell, he said finally. Fought in the war union side. Came west after looking for a fresh start. Met Hannah in Denver. She was a school teacher. We married, came out here to build something of our own. He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. Samuel was born the second winter. Good boy. Strong. Had his mother's eyes. The grief in his voice was raw despite the years that had passed. Abigail waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. Neighbor moved in the next spring. William Holloway. Wanted the water rights to the creek that runs through the north end of my property. When I wouldn't sell, he dammed it upstream on his land, diverted the flow. Emmett's voice had hardened, left us with just the pond water, stagnant, tainted. Abigail's hand went to her throat, understanding the terrible conclusion to this story. And that's when Hannah and Samuel, Emmett nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. Typhoid. Took them both within a week of each other. His hands clenched again. Doctor from town said it was the water that did it. Nothing to be done. I'm so sorry, Abigail whispered, the words wholly inadequate for such a loss. Holloway's gone now, Emmett continued, his tone flat. Works for the railroad company these days, I hear. Sold his land to them after. He didn't finish the sentence, but Abigail could imagine what had happened after Hannah and Samuel died. A confrontation, perhaps. Violence or the threat of it that had driven Holloway away. Is that why you stay here? She asked gently. Because of memories. Emmett's gaze met hers unflinching. Stay because it's mine. Built it with my own hands for my family. Won't be driven off by ghosts or grief. The simple declaration held a fierce pride that Abigail couldn't help but respect. Here was a man who faced his pain head-on, who refused to flee, that as she had done. And now you want to build a new family, she said softly. Is that it? Life goes on, Emmett replied, looking away. Land needs working, house needs filling, man wasn't meant to be alone. Biblical echoes in his words reminded Abigail once more of her preacher father. It was not good for man to be alone, God had said in Genesis. So he had created Eve as a helpmate for Adam. Was that what Emmett was seeking? Not just a broodmare, as she had crudely accused, but a partner. Someone to share the burden of survival in this harsh, beautiful wilderness. I understand your conditions, Emmett said, breaking into her thoughts. They're reasonable enough, but I have one of my own. Abigail raised an eyebrow, waiting. If we do this, he said slowly, it's a real marriage, on paper and before God. No temporary arrangement, no changing your mind when spring comes and the road's clear. The finality of his condition struck Abigail like a physical blow. A permanent commitment to a man she barely knew in a place far from civilization with no easy escape if things went wrong. That's asking a great deal, she said carefully. Offering a great deal too, Emmett countered. Security, stability, home for your children, future for all of us. He wasn't wrong. What he offered was precisely what Abigail had feared she would never find again after Thomas died. Safety, certainty, a roof that wouldn't be taken away by creditors' food, that wouldn't run out when money did. I need more time, she said finally. This isn't a decision to be made lightly. Emmett nodded, picking up his whittling again. Like I said before, spring's a long way off. The conversation subsided, but Abigail's mind continued to race with possibilities and fears. Marriage to Emmett Stone would solve her most pressing problems, shelter, food, protection from the creditors who might still be searching for her. But at what cost to her independence? Her sense of self, yet was independence worth clinging to when her children went hungry? Was pride worth preserving at the expense of their future? The questions followed Abigail to bed, haunting her dreams with visions of possible futures, some comforting, others terrifying. By morning, she was no closer to a decision, but she had gained a clearer understanding of the man who had rescued them from the storm. Emmett Stone was a man shaped by loss, hardened by grief, but not broken by it. He was offering them not just shelter from winter, but a place in the life he was determined to rebuild. Whether she would accept that offer remained to be seen, but Abigail could no longer dismiss it as absurd or insulting. It was in its way as much an act of courage as it was of practicality, a damaged soul reaching out for connection, despite the risk of further pain. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Abigail rose to face another day in this strange limbo. They inhabited no longer strangers, but not yet family, suspended between past losses and future possibilities, waiting for a decision that would alter all their lives irrevocably. Days melded into weeks as winter maintained its icy grip on the land. February arrived with bitter winds and fresh snowfall that further isolated the small cabin from the outside world. Yet within those sturdy log walls, something unexpected was taking root, a fragile sense of routine, of shared purpose, of connection. Each morning, Abigail woke to find the fire already built up, coffee brewing on the stove, and Emmett preparing to head out to the barn. Each evening, they gathered around the table for meals, that while simple filled bellies that had known hunger too intimately. And in between, they found ways to coexist in the confined space without treading too heavily on one another's wounds. The children adapted with the remarkable resilience of youth. Noah followed Emmett like a shadow whenever permitted, absorbing lessons about trapping, tracking, and caring for livestock with eager attention. Emma appointed herself helper, to them both fetching tools for Emmett and assisting Abigail with household tasks with an earnestness that belied her 5 years. It was Emma who discovered the old bookshelf tucked in a corner of the main room, partially hidden behind a trunk. "Mama, look," she exclaimed one afternoon, while Emmett and Noah were checking the trap lines. "There are so many books." Abigail looked up from the mending she was working on, surprised. She had noticed the shelf before, but hadn't examined it closely. Now she joined her daughter, running her fingers along the spines of volumes that ranged from practical guides on farming and animal husbandry to well-worn classics of literature. "Mr. Stone has quite a collection," she murmured, pulling out a copy of Paradise Lost that showed signs of frequent reading. "Can we read one, Mama, please?" Emma pleaded, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Books had been a luxury they had been forced to leave behind in Denver. "We should ask Mr. Stone first," Abigail cautioned. "These are his possessions." But when Emmett returned, his response to their inquiry was a simple shrug. "Books are meant for reading," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "Help yourselves." That evening, Abigail read aloud from a collection of folk tales while the children sat wrapped by the fire, and Emmett whittled quietly in his chair. His face remained impassive, but occasionally she caught his gaze lifting from his work to observe the scene with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something between longing and wariness, as if witnessing something precious but dangerous. It became a nightly ritual, reading aloud after dinner, while the wind howled outside and the fire crackled within. Sometimes Abigail chose poetry, sometimes prose, but always she was aware of Emmett listening, though he rarely commented. One evening, as she closed a volume of Tennyson's poems, Abigail found the courage to ask, "Did Hannah enjoy reading as well?" The question hung in the air, bold in its directness. Emmett's hand stilled on the piece of wood he was shaping. For a moment, Abigail feared she had overstepped, probing too deeply into wounds still raw, despite the passage of years. "She did," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "Used to read to Samuel every night before bed. Said it would make him clever." A ghost of a smile touched his lips beneath the beard. Boy wasn't even 2, but she was determined he'd grow up loving books as she did. The glimpse into his past life freely offered felt like a gift, or perhaps a test. Abigail accepted it with the gravity it deserved. "She sounds like she was a wonderful mother." She was. Emmett set down his carving and rose, moving to the bookshelf. After a moment's search, he withdrew a large, leather-bound Bible, the one Abigail had noticed before, set apart from the other books. This was hers, a wedding gift from her father. He held it carefully, his large hands gentle around the worn leather cover. Then, to Abigail's surprise, he extended it toward her. "You might want to look through it, has some good passages marked." Abigail accepted the Bible with appropriate reverence, understanding that this was no small gesture. "Thank you. I'll be careful with it." Emmett nodded once, then retreated to the door. "Need to check on the livestock before turning in," he said, reaching for his coat. "Nights are getting colder again." After he left, Abigail sat with the Bible in her lap, feeling the weight of trust it represented. The children had already been tucked into bed, leaving her alone with this unexpected connection to Emmett's past. She opened it carefully, noting the fine paper and clear print. Inside the front cover, written in a delicate hand, was an inscription, "To my beloved daughter Hannah on her wedding day. May God's word light your path through all life's joys and sorrows. With love, Father." As Abigail turned the pages, she discovered pressed flowers marking certain passages, a sprig of lavender at Psalm 23, a faded violet at 1 Corinthians 13, a small wildflower she didn't recognize at Proverbs 31. Hannah's bookmarks preserved like fragments of her spirit within the sacred text. But as she continued, Abigail noticed something odd. Several pages appeared to have been torn out. The ragged edges remained evidence of a violent removal that contrasted sharply with the careful preservation of the rest of the volume. What passages had been so painful that Emmett couldn't bear their presence? What words of comfort or condemnation had he excised from this cherished heirloom? She was still pondering this when the door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and Emmett's looming figure. He stamped his boots free of snow and hung his coat without comment, but his eyes immediately went to the Bible in her hands. "Found the marked passages?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Abigail nodded. She had beautiful taste in scripture, she said truthfully. Then, deciding honesty was the only proper response to his trust, she added, "I noticed some pages are missing." Emmett's expression hardened momentarily before he controlled it. "Cut them out after they died," he said bluntly. "Couldn't stand to read those particular verses anymore." Which ones? Abigail asked softly, not expecting an answer. To her surprise, he responded, Job, about how the Lord gives and takes away, and some from Romans about all things working together for good. His voice grew rough. Didn't seem true anymore. The admission, stark in its honesty, devastating in its implications, laid bare the depth of his spiritual struggle. Here was a man who had not only lost his family, but had fought with his faith as well, going so far as to physically remove the passages he could no longer reconcile with his experience. I understand, Abigail said simply because she did. After Thomas died, leaving her pregnant and destitute with two small children, she too had questioned the God of her childhood, the benevolent father her own father had preached about with such certainty. Do you? Emmett's gaze met hers directly, searching for platitudes or judgment. My father was a preacher, Abigail said, offering a piece of her own past in exchange. I grew up believing that faith could move mountains, that prayer always received an answer, that God never gave burdens too heavy to bear. She looked down at the Bible, tracing her finger along its leather binding. After Thomas died, I found those beliefs harder to hold on to. Emmett settled into his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. What kind of God lets children die? He asked, the question clearly rhetorical, born of years of silent wrestling. What kind of father watches his son suffer and does nothing? The questions hung in the air, unanswerable in their raw pain. Abigail didn't try to offer empty consolations or theological justifications. Instead, she closed the Bible gently and set it aside. I don't know, she admitted. I've asked similar questions myself these past months. I haven't found satisfying answers. Something in Emmett's posture eased slightly at her honesty. Your father, he said after a moment, what would he have said? Abigail considered this, remembering the passionate sermons of Reverend Bennett, his unwavering conviction in divine providence. He would have said that God's ways are not our ways, that his purpose is beyond our understanding, that faith means trusting, even when the path is dark. Sounds like a man of strong beliefs, Emmett observed. He was, Abigail agreed, sometimes too strong. There was little room for doubt in his worldview. She hesitated, then added, we weren't close in his later years. He disapproved of Thomas, thought him unreliable too, given to grand schemes and dreams. He wasn't wrong, Emmett said, then caught himself. Forgive me, that was unkind. But not untrue, Abigail acknowledged with a small, sad smile. Thomas was a dreamer. It was what I loved about him at first, his boundless optimism, his certainty that the next venture would be the one to succeed. But dreams don't feed children or pay debts. The admission cost her something, to voice aloud a final surrender of the idealized image of her marriage she had clung to, despite everything. Thomas had loved her, yes, but he had failed her too, leaving her vulnerable in a world that showed little mercy to women alone. Emmett nodded, accepting her words without comment. After a moment, he rose and moved to a small chest near the fireplace, not the carved one that had caught Abigail's attention before, but a plainer box of sturdy construction. He opened it and withdrew something small that gleamed in the firelight. Been meaning to give you this, he said, returning to where she sat. He held out his hand, revealing a simple gold band. Was my mother's. If you decide, well, you should have a proper ring. Abigail stared at the ring, its significance unmistakable. This wasn't just any token, it was a family heirloom, something precious and personal. The offering of it represented more than a practical arrangement. It suggested a depth of commitment she hadn't fully grasped before. Emmett, she said, using his given name for the first time. I haven't decided yet. I know, he replied, still holding out the ring. But if you do, it's yours, should have a proper symbol. Hesitantly, Abigail reached out and took the ring, feeling its weight in her palm, a small circle of gold that represented such a momentous choice. Thank you, she said softly. I'll keep it safe until I decide. Emmett nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. Getting late, he observed, glancing at the small clock on the mantel. Should turn in. As had become their routine, he prepared his makeshift bed on the bench near the fire, while Abigail retired to the bedroom she shared with the children. But that night, as she lay awake listening to the wind outside, Abigail's thoughts were fixed on the small ring she had placed carefully in the pocket of her dress. What kind of man offered a family heirloom to a woman he barely knew? What did it say about Emmett Stone that he would entrust such a token to her before she had even accepted his proposition? There was a straightforward honor in the gesture that touched her deeply, making the decision before her both clearer and more complex. Morning brought a rare break in the winter weather, a day of brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling spectacle. Emmett announced at breakfast that he needed to ride to the nearest neighbor, some 5 miles distant, to borrow a tool for repairing the barn roof. Could take the children, he offered, noting their eager expressions at the mention of an excursion. Get them some fresh air, change of scenery. Abigail hesitated, protective instincts warring with the knowledge that Noah and Emma had been confined to the cabin in its immediate surroundings for weeks. Is it safe the cold? Got a sled they can ride in, Emmett assured her. Plenty of blankets. Sun's strong today. Petersons have children of their own, might do yours good to see some new faces. The prospect of a few hours alone was tempting time to consider her situation without distraction, and the children's pleading faces were difficult to resist. Very well, she conceded, but bundle them up thoroughly, and if the weather changes at all, return immediately. While Emmett helped the children into their warmest clothes, Abigail packed a small bundle of food for their journey-bred cheese and dried apple slices. She fussed over Emma's scarf and Noah's buttons, earning a patient look from Emmett that almost qualified as amusement. They'll be fine, he said, lifting both children onto the sled he had prepared. It was a sturdy construction with high sides to keep them secure, lined with blankets and furs for warmth. The large draft horse harnessed to it stamped its feet, eager to move. Be good for Mr. Stone, Abigail instructed, kissing each child's forehead. Mind what he tells you. We will, Mama, Noah promised solemnly. Bye, Mama, Emma added cheerfully, already wrapped so thoroughly in blankets that only her bright eyes were visible. Abigail stood in the doorway watching until the sled disappeared around a bend in the snow-covered track that served as a road. The silence that followed their departure was profound, the first true solitude she had experienced since the night the blizzard drove them to Emmett's door. She moved through the cabin, tidying what little needed tidying, then settled at the table with a cup of tea. The Bible Emmett had shown her the night before still rested where she had left it. After a moment's hesitation, Abigail opened it again, turning to the ragged edges where pages had been torn out. Job 1:21, Romans 8:28. She knew the passages well. Her father had quoted them often enough. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, and all things work together for good to them that love God. Words meant to comfort that had instead become salt in wounds too deep for platitudes. Abigail understood Emmett's impulse to remove them physically from the book, as if doing so might somehow excise them from the fabric of faith itself. Her gaze fell on the carved chest in the corner, the one Emmett had identified as Hannah's wedding gift from her father. What did it contain? Mementos of a life cut short, keepsakes too painful to display, but too precious to discard. Curiosity warred with respect for privacy. Abigail knew she should leave it untouched, yet something drew her to it. Perhaps the desire to understand better the man who had offered her not just shelter, but a future. Before she could resolve the internal debate, a sound at the door startled her. It was too soon for Emmett and the children to have returned. Perhaps a neighbor or an animal seeking shelter. Abigail moved cautiously to the window, peering out. A horse stood in the yard, steam rising from its flanks, as if it had been ridden hard. The rider, a man she didn't recognize, was already dismounting, his movements suggesting urgency. Instinctively, Abigail stepped back from the window, a familiar fear coiling in her stomach. Who was this stranger, and what did he want? Had the creditors somehow tracked her here to this remote cabin in the wilderness? A sharp knock rattled the door. Hello, anyone home? A male voice called out. I'm looking for Emmett Stone. Abigail remained silent, hoping the man would assume the cabin was empty and leave. But the knocking came again, more insistent. I know someone's in there, saw smoke from the chimney. It's important I speak with Stone. Something in the voice, a note of genuine concern rather than menace, made Abigail reconsider her silence. Cautiously, she approached the door. Mr. Stone isn't here at present, she called through the thick wood. He's expected back later today. There was a pause. Who am I speaking with, ma'am? The voice asked, sounding genuinely confused. Abigail hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. A guest of Mr. Stone's, she said finally. Who are you, and what business do you have with him? Name's Michael Peterson, the man replied. I'm a neighbor. Stone was supposed to come by today to borrow a saw, but I got word that needs to reach him urgently. Would you mind opening the door, ma'am? It's bitter cold out here. Peterson, the name Emmett had mentioned that morning. This must be the neighbor he intended to visit. Somewhat reassured, Abigail unlatched the door, opening it cautiously. The man on the threshold was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with a weathered face and honest eyes. He removed his hat respectfully when he saw her. "Ma'am," he greeted, clearly surprised to find a woman in Emmett Stone's cabin. "I apologize for the intrusion." "Mr. Peterson," Abigail acknowledged, opening the door wider to admit him. "Please come in from the cold." He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots and rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth. His curious gaze took in Abigail's presence, noting the signs of habitation that clearly included a woman and children. "I didn't realize Stone had company," he said diplomatically. "My children and I were caught in the blizzard last month." Abigail explained, feeling a need to clarify the situation. "Mr. Stone found us and offered shelter until the weather improves enough for travel." Understanding dawned in Peterson's expression. "That explains it. Stone keeps to himself most times. Wasn't like him to miss our usual Sunday greeting at the property line." His face grew serious, which makes what I've come to tell him all the more concerning. "What is it?" Abigail asked, a flutter of worry stirring in her chest. Peterson hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share with this stranger. "There's a man asking about him in town," he said finally. "Arrived yesterday on the stage from Denver. Been showing a drawing around, asking if anyone's seen Stone." Abigail's heart skipped a beat. "What sort of man? Did he give a name or reason?" "Calls himself Frederick Parker," Peterson replied, watching her reaction closely. "Says he represents the Western Pacific Railroad Company. Claims they're interested in purchasing water rights in the area." The name meant nothing to Abigail, but the mention of the railroad company sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Emmett had mentioned that William Holloway, the neighbor who had dammed the creek and indirectly caused Hannah and Samuel's deaths, now worked for the railroad. "Did this Mr. Parker mention anyone else he was looking for?" she asked carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "A woman and children, perhaps?" Peterson's gaze sharpened. As a matter of fact, he did. Said he was also trying to locate a widow and her 2 young ones who might have passed through the area. Said there was a family matter that needed resolving. A family matter. The euphemism might have made Abigail laugh if fear hadn't closed her throat. Thomas had no living family apart from the distant cousin in Tucson. This man, whoever he truly was looking for her and had somehow tracked her to this remote corner of the territory. "Mrs. Peterson," prompted when she remained silent. "Morgan," Abigail supplied automatically, then immediately regretted revealing even that much. "Mr. Peterson, when is Emmett Mr. Stone expected at your property?" "That's just it," Peterson said, his brow furrowing with concern. "He should have arrived by now." "The children with him, they're yours, I take it?" Abigail nodded, fresh worry blooming in her chest. "Yes, Noah and Emma. Mr. Stone offered to take them for an outing while he visited your home." "Then something's delayed them," Peterson said, moving back toward the door. "I passed no sled on my way here, and there is only one trail between our properties." "Perhaps he took a different route," Abigail suggested, trying to keep the rising panic from her voice. Peterson shook his head. "Not likely. Too much risk of getting lost in these hills if you stray from the established trails." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll backtrack, see if I can find them. You stay here in case they return by another way." "Wait," Abigail said as he reached for the door latch. "This man Parker, what did he look like?" Peterson considered for a moment. "Tall, well-dressed, city clothes not suited for the territory, dark hair clean shaven except for a mustache, had a scar above his right eye." He paused, studying her reaction. "You know him." The description matched no one Abigail could recall, but that meant little. The creditors Thomas had left behind were numerous, and any one of them might have hired someone to track her down. "I don't think so," she said honestly. "But I left Denver rather suddenly after my husband's death. There were complications." Understanding flickered in Peterson's eyes. "Debts," he guessed. Abigail nodded, not bothering to elaborate. Frontier communities understood the harsh realities of survival all too well. "Well, if this Parker is looking for you, you might want to be scarce when he comes sniffing around," Peterson advised. "Stone's place is remote enough that you should have warning before anyone arrives. But still." "Thank you for the warning," Abigail said sincerely, "and for looking for my children." Peterson nodded, then stepped back into the cold. I'll find them, he promised. Stone knows these hills better than anyone. They're probably just taking their time showing the little ones the sights. After he left, Abigail paced the cabin anxiously, her mind racing between two fears: the mysterious man asking questions in town and the absence of Emmett and her children. The rational part of her mind insisted there was likely a simple explanation for the delay. Perhaps they had indeed taken a different route or stopped to explore something that caught the children's interest. But deeper instincts honed by months of looking over her shoulder whispered darker possibilities. What if this Parker had somehow found them on the trail? What if Emmett, for all his imposing presence, had been caught unaware while responsible for two small children? The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Abigail kept the fire built up, prepared a stew for dinner that no one was there to eat, and watched the window as the brilliant day gradually surrendered to the long shadows of late afternoon. Just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose, Abigail heard the welcome sound of hooves and runners on packed snow. She rushed to the door, flinging it open in time to see Emmett's sled rounding the bend in the trail, the draft horse plodding steadily through the snow. Relief flooded her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Noah and Emma were still bundled in the sled, apparently unharmed. Emmett walked alongside, one hand on the horse's bridle, guiding it toward the cabin. Thank God, Abigail breathed, hurrying out to meet them despite the cold. What happened? I've been worried sick. Emmett's expression was grim beneath his beard. Ran into trouble on the trail, he said tersely. Children are fine, just tired. Get them inside. Noah and Emma were indeed exhausted, their small faces drawn with fatigue, but lighting up at the sight of their mother. Abigail helped them from the sled, noting how they clung to her with unusual intensity. Are you both all right? She asked, kneeling to check them over, despite Emmett's assurance. What happened? A man stopped us, Noah said, his voice small. He asked Mr. Stone lots of questions. Mr. Stone told us to be very quiet, Emma added, her eyes wide. The man wasn't nice, Mama. Abigail looked up to find Emmett watching them, his expression unreadable. Get them inside, he repeated. Need to see to the horse first. Then we'll talk. The children were reluctant to let go of her, but Abigail managed to usher them into the cabin, helping them out of their snow-crusted outer garments, and settling them by the fire with cups of warm milk sweetened with honey. Only when they were comfortable, their color returning to their cheeks, did she press for more details. This man who stopped you, she began carefully, what did he look like? Noah frowned in concentration. Tall, but not as tall as Mr. Stone. He wore a fancy coat and had a big hat, and a mustache. He demonstrated with his finger across his upper lip. Did he say his name? Abigail asked, though she already suspected the answer. Mr. Parker, Emma supplied. He said he was looking for a friend. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. But I don't think he was really Mr. Stone's friend. They didn't smile at each other. The door opened, admitting Emmett and a blast of cold air. He secured it behind him, then moved to the fire, extending his hands toward the flames. His expression was shuttered, his movements controlled in a way that suggested barely contained anger. Children need rest, he said without preamble. Been a long day for them. Abigail recognized the dismissal for what it was. He didn't want to discuss what had happened in front of Noah and Emma. Yes, of course, she agreed, rising. Let's get you both ready for bed. You can have a proper dinner in the morning. Despite their exhaustion, the children protested being sent to bed so early. But Abigail was firm, and soon they were tucked beneath the blankets in the small bedroom, their eyes already drooping despite their insistence that they weren't tired. When she returned to the main room, Emmett was seated at the table, a glass of amber liquid in front of him. Whiskey. Abigail realized something she hadn't seen him drink in all the weeks they'd been there. Your neighbor Michael Peterson came by while you were gone, she said, taking the seat across from him. He warned me about a man asking questions in town. Emmett nodded once, taking a measured sip from his glass. Met him on the trail. Parker. Claims to represent the railroad. What did he want? Abigail asked, though she feared she already knew. Said he was interested in purchasing water rights in the area. Emmett replied, his voice flat. Offered a generous sum for mine. When I declined, he mentioned he was also looking for a widow and her children who might have passed through recently. Abigail's blood ran cold. Did he say why? Family matter requiring resolution according to him. Emmett's gray eyes met hers directly. Said the widow's late husband had outstanding debts to several investors, including the railroad. Said they were concerned for her welfare and wanted to offer assistance. The transparent lie would have been laughable if it weren't so ominous. "And what did you tell him?" "That I hadn't seen any widow or children," Emmett said simply. "That travelers are rare in these parts, especially in winter." Relief washed over Abigail. "Thank you," she said softly. Emmett studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "This man," he said finally, "he's one of the creditors you're running from." "I don't know," Abigail admitted. "I don't recognize the name or description, but Thomas left debts with many people, and any one of them might have hired someone to track me down." "Hired a railroad man?" Emmett's tone was skeptical. "Seems excessive for a personal debt." A cold realization dawned on Abigail. "Unless Thomas borrowed from the railroad itself," she whispered. "He was always seeking investors for his schemes. He might have approached them for funding." Emmett's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "Railroad doesn't lend money to individuals without collateral," he said. "What could your husband have offered as security for such a loan?" Abigail shook her head, mystified. "We had nothing of value by the end. The house was mortgaged to its limit. The furniture was mostly rented. There was nothing left to, She stopped abruptly, a terrible possibility surfacing in her mind. Thomas had inherited a small parcel of land from his father somewhere in the Arizona territory. He had always dismissed it as worthless, too remote, too arid for farming. But if the railroad was planning expansion in that area, there was land, she said slowly, a small holding Thomas inherited, but it was undeveloped miles from anywhere. He always said it wasn't worth the paper the deed was printed on. "Location?" Emmett asked sharply. "I'm not certain," Abigail confessed. "Somewhere in the territory. Thomas kept the deed in his lockbox at the bank. I never saw it myself." Emmett rose abruptly, moving to a shelf where several rolled maps were stored. He selected one and spread it on the table, weighing down the corners with small objects. "Railroad's been buying up land along proposed routes," he said, tracing a line with his finger across the territorial map. "Planning expansion south and west. If your husband's property was anywhere along these corridors, it would suddenly be valuable," Abigail finished, understanding dawning. "But why send someone to find me? The deed would still be in Thomas's name. As his widow, you'd have claim to it," Emmett pointed out, "especially with children to provide for. Courts would likely rule in your favor if there was a dispute." The implications settled over Abigail like a physical weight. If the railroad wanted Thomas's land badly enough to send someone searching for her, the property must be significant to their plans and therefore potentially valuable enough to solve all her financial problems. "I need to get to Tucson," she said, thinking aloud. "Find a lawyer, establish my claim to the property before they can contest it." Emmett's expression darkened. "Tucson's still weeks away, even in good weather," he reminded her. "And this Parker knows you're in the area now. He'll be watching the trails." "Then what do you suggest?" Abigail asked, frustration edging into her voice. "I can't hide forever. Eventually he'll find us here." Emmett was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the map before them. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, deliberate. "Marry me." Abigail blinked, startled by the abrupt return to his proposition. "I don't see how that would—" "As my wife, you'd have legal protection," Emmett interrupted. "Your property would become our property. Railroad would have to deal with me as well as you." "That's hardly a romantic proposal," Abigail observed, trying to mask her confusion with lightness. "Not meant to be romantic," Emmett replied bluntly. "Meant to be practical. This Parker, whoever he really is, he's not just after your land. The way he was looking at the children," he trailed off, his expression hardening. "Man's got other motives, I'd wager." A chill ran through Abigail as she recalled the night she had fled Denver, the creditor forcing his way into her home, his eyes gleaming with something more predatory than financial interest. "You think he means us harm? Think he's not just here for deeds and debts," Emmett said carefully. "The way he asked about you, it was personal. And when I denied knowing your whereabouts, there was something in his eyes I didn't care for." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Whoever Frederick Parker was, his interest in finding Abigail went beyond recovering a debt or securing a piece of land for his employers. "As my husband, you'd be obligated to protect me," Abigail said slowly, thinking it through. And the children would be under your guardianship as well. Emmett nodded once. Frontier law respects marriage bonds. Man has right to defend his family by any means necessary. The pragmatism of the arrangement was undeniable. Marriage to Emmett would provide not just financial security, but physical protection as well as shield against whatever threat this Parker represented. Yet Abigail hesitated, her hand unconsciously going to the pocket where she had stored the ring Emmett had given her the previous night. Marriage is a sacred covenant, she said softly, echoing words her father had often preached. Not something to be entered into lightly or for convenience alone. Nothing convenient about it, Emmett countered, his gaze steady. Hard work on both sides, commitment, sacrifice, but also protection, security, possibility of something good growing from necessity. There was a rough poetry in his assessment that struck Abigail deeply. This was not a man given to false promises or pretty words. What he offered was substantial, rooted in reality rather than romance, yet not entirely without hope for genuine connection. I need time to think, she said finally. Don't have much time, Emmett replied, glancing toward the window where darkness had fully descended. Parker will be back. He knows the general area now. Won't take him long to find this cabin. The urgency was real, Abigail acknowledged silently. Every day they delayed increased the risk of discovery. Yet marriage, even one begun as a practical arrangement, was not a decision to be made in haste or fear. Until morning, she requested. Give me until morning to consider. Emmett studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Until morning, he agreed, but we should be prepared to move quickly if necessary. That night, after Emmett had retired to his customary place by the fire and the cabin had settled into darkness, Abigail lay awake beside her sleeping children, turning the gold band over and over in her fingers. What would Thomas think of her even considering such an arrangement? Would he understand the desperate pragmatism that drove her to contemplate marriage to a near stranger? Or would he see it as a betrayal of the love they had shared, imperfect though it had been? And what of her father with his rigid views on marriage and propriety? Would he condemn her for considering a union based on mutual need rather than romantic love? Or would he, with his practical frontier faith, recognize the hand of Providence in their unusual meeting? More importantly, what did she herself believe? Was this merely a convenient solution to her immediate problems? Or could it be something more, a genuine chance at rebuilding a life from the ashes of loss? Emmett Stone was not Thomas. He lacked her late husband's charm and easy manner, his quick smile and effusive affection. But he possessed qualities Thomas had lacked: steadiness, reliability, a clear-eyed understanding of the harsh realities of frontier life. And there was kindness in him too, Abigail had discovered. It showed in his patient teaching of Noah, his gentle handling of Emma, his respect for Abigail's own boundaries and needs. He was a man shaped by grief, yes, but not broken by it, still capable of reaching out, of offering a place in his life to those who needed one. Could such a beginning grow into something worthy of the sacred covenant of marriage? Or would they forever remain strangers bound by circumstance, sharing a home but not truly a life? The questions circled in Abigail's mind, finding no resolution as the night deepened around the isolated cabin. Outside, the moon cast silver light across the snow, creating shadows that might conceal any manner of threats. Inside, she clutched a small circle of gold and weighed the price of safety against the risk of binding herself to an unknown future. Morning arrived with the soft pink light of dawn filtering through the frost-covered window. Abigail rose carefully, trying not to wake the children, who still slumbered deeply after their exhausting day. She dressed quickly in the cold room, then slipped the gold band onto her finger, not as a decision made, but as a tangible reminder of the choice before her. In the main room, she found Emmett already awake, building up the fire. He glanced up as she entered, his gaze immediately going to her hand where the ring gleamed in the firelight. Your answer, he asked simply. Abigail took a deep breath, steadying herself. Before I give it, there's something you should know, something I haven't told you about why I fled Denver. Emmett straightened, giving her his full attention. The flames cast his scarred face in stark relief, highlighting the weariness in his gray eyes, but also the quiet strength that had drawn her to trust him despite her initial fears. After Thomas died, Abigail began, her voice low to avoid waking the children. A man came to collect on a debt. I couldn't pay, we had nothing left. He He said there were other ways a widow might settle her husband's obligations. Understanding darkened Emmett's expression. He threatened you. More than threatened, Abigail admitted, forcing herself to continue despite the shame that still burned within her. He forced his way into our home. If I hadn't managed to strike him with the fire iron and flee with the children that night. She trailed off, unable to voice the horror that might have befallen them. The child you carry, Emmett said carefully, his gaze dropping to her swollen belly. Is it? It's Thomas's, Abigail interrupted firmly. That much I'm certain of. I was already with child when he fell ill. But I need you to understand why I'm so afraid of this Parker, whoever he is. If he's connected to the men Thomas owed money to. Emmett's expression hardened into something dangerous. No man will harm you or the children while I draw breath. He said, the oath quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Whether you accept my proposal or not, give you my word on that. The promise, freely given without condition, touched something deep in Abigail's heart. Here was a man who understood honor in its most fundamental sense, not as a social nicety, but as a code by which to live and, if necessary, die. Thank you, she said softly, truly meaning it. Then, drawing a deep breath, she continued, my answer is yes, I will marry you, Emmett Stone. He went very still, as if her acceptance, despite his urgency the night before, had caught him by surprise. You're certain? He asked after a moment. Not just because of Parker. Not just because of him, Abigail confirmed. Though I won't pretend he isn't part of my decision, but also because of what you've shown me these past weeks, that you're a man of your word, that you're kind to my children, that you offer not just protection, but the chance to build something lasting. She twisted the ring on her finger, feeling its unfamiliar weight. I can't promise romantic love, she added honestly. My heart is still healing from Thomas's loss, but I can promise respect, partnership, and faithfulness to whatever bond we forge together. Emmett nodded slowly, accepting her terms without comment. After a moment, he said, we should ride to town today, find the preacher, make it official before Parker returns. The practicality of his response was so characteristic that Abigail found herself smiling faintly. No effusive declarations of gratitude or happiness, just the next logical step in the plan he had proposed. What about the children, she asked. After yesterday, I'm reluctant to take them on the trail again. Peterson and his wife would watch them, Emmett suggested. Good people. Children would be safe there while we're in town. The arrangement made sense, though Abigail's protective instincts rebelled at the thought of being separated from Noah and Emma even for a few hours. But if they were to secure the legal protection marriage would provide, it was a necessary risk. Very well, she agreed. When should we leave? Soon as the children are awake and fed, Emmett said, moving toward the stove. I'll prepare breakfast while you get them ready. The domestic simplicity of the moment, planning a wedding over morning preparations, discussing childcare arrangements as if they were already a family, struck Abigail with its strangeness. This was not how she had imagined her life unfolding when she fled Denver in the night, terrified and alone. Yet here she was, accepting a second chance at security, at family, at a future that might contain more than mere survival. As she moved to wake Noah and Emma to begin explaining the momentous change about to occur in their young lives, Abigail felt the weight of the gold band on her finger, a small circle representing not just protection from harm, but the possibility of healing, of building something new from the broken pieces of their respective past. Whatever came next, whether threat from the mysterious Parker or the challenges of forging a marriage from necessity rather than passion, they would face it not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as a family bound by choice and commitment. The thought brought an unexpected sense of peace, a quieting of the fear that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death. For the first time in months, Abigail Morgan looked toward the future with something resembling hope. The journey to town was undertaken in tense silence, with Emmett driving the sleigh and Abigail seated beside him, bundled against the cold. They had left the children with the Petersons, as planned a parting that had been more difficult than Abigail anticipated. Noah had understood the necessity with solemn acceptance beyond his years, but Emma had clung to her mother with tearful reluctance, sensing the significance of the day's events even without fully comprehending them. They'll be safe, Emmett had reassured her as they pulled away from the Peterson homestead. Michael keeps a loaded rifle by the door, and his wife is as fierce as any mountain lion when it comes to protecting young ones. The town of Silver Creek was smaller than Abigail had imagined, a single main street lined with utilitarian buildings, most constructed of rough-hewn timber. A general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a combination post office and telegraph office comprised the commercial district. At the far end stood a white clapboard church, modest but well-maintained, with a small cemetery behind it. Emmett drew the horse to a halt in front of the church. "Preacher Walsh lives into the back," he explained, helping Abigail down from the sleigh. "Good man, discreet." The snow crunched beneath their boots as they approached the church door. Abigail's heart hammered in her chest, a mixture of anxiety and surreal disbelief making her lightheaded. Was she really about to marry this man she had known for barely a month, to bind her life and her children's futures to a near stranger, no matter how honorable he had proven himself to be? For Emmett could knock the church door open, revealing a tall, thin man with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Emmett Stone," he said, genuine pleasure warming his voice. "It's been too long since you've darkened my doorstep." "Preacher," Emmett acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Got a matter that requires your attention if you're available." Preacher Walsh's gaze shifted to Abigail, curiosity evident in his expression. "I see you've brought company. Please, both of you, come in out of the cold." The interior of the church was simple but dignified, plain wooden pews facing a modest altar, with sunlight streaming through small, stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns across the worn floorboards. Walsh led them to a small office at the rear, gesturing for them to take seats while he settled behind a desk cluttered with books and papers. "Now then," he said, folding his hands atop the desk, "how may I assist you today?" Emmett glanced at Abigail, seeming to defer to her in this moment. She cleared her throat, suddenly finding it difficult to articulate the purpose of their visit. "We wish to be married," she said finally, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "Today, if possible." If Walsh was surprised by this announcement, he concealed it well. His gaze moved thoughtfully between them, assessing in a way that was not unkind but certainly thorough. "Marriage is a sacred covenant before God," he said after a moment, "not something to be entered into hastily or without due consideration." "We understand that, preacher," Emmett replied, his deep voice steady. "Circumstances have accelerated our timetable, but the decision wasn't made lightly." Walsh nodded slowly. "And these circumstances, might I inquire as to their nature?" Abigail and Emmett exchanged a glance, silently debating how much to reveal. It was Abigail who finally spoke, choosing her words carefully. "I am a widow, Preacher Walsh, with 2 young children and another on the way," she explained. "When my husband died, he left substantial debts that forced me to flee Denver. Mr. Stone took us in when we were caught in the blizzard last month and has shown us nothing but kindness and protection." "I see," Walsh said, though his expression suggested he sensed there was more to the story. "And now you wish to formalize this arrangement through marriage." "There's a man looking for Mrs. Morgan," Emmett interjected, his tone hardening slightly. "Claims to represent the railroad, but his interest seems more personal. As her husband, I'd have legal right to defend her and the children against any threat." Understanding dawned in Walsh's eyes. "I begin to grasp the urgency," he said. "However, I must ask directly, Mrs. Morgan, are you entering into this union of your own free will without coercion of any kind?" "I am," Abigail replied without hesitation. "Mr. Stone has been nothing but honorable in his treatment of me and my children. This marriage is a mutual agreement for our collective benefit and protection." Walsh studied her for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of doubt or fear. Whatever he saw in her expression must have satisfied him, for he nodded once and rose from his desk. "Very well," he said. "I will perform the ceremony. However, we will need witnesses. The law requires at least 2. "The doctor," Emmett suggested, "and perhaps Mrs. Peterson, if she can be spared from watching the children." "I'll send for them," Walsh agreed. "In the meantime, Mrs. Morgan, my wife, might have a dress you could borrow if you wish. Nothing elaborate, but perhaps more suited to a wedding than traveling clothes." The offer, so unexpectedly thoughtful, brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "That's very kind," she managed. "Thank you." While Emmett went to fetch the doctor, Abigail followed Preacher Walsh to the small house attached to the rear of the church. Mrs. Walsh, a plump, motherly woman with bright eyes and quick movements, welcomed her warmly despite the unusual circumstances. "It's not every day we host an impromptu wedding," she said cheerfully, leading Abigail to a modest bedroom. But the Lord works in mysterious ways, and who are we to question his timing? The dress she offered was simple but lovely deep blue wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. My Sunday best, Mrs. Walsh explained, helping Abigail into it. A bit loose in the shoulders, but we can pin it. As Mrs. Walsh fussed with the fit, Abigail caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the dresser. The woman who gazed back seemed simultaneously familiar and strange, her features the same, but her circumstances so altered from what they had been just months ago. Thomas's widow, soon to be Emmett's wife. A woman who had fled in desperate fear, now choosing a path forward with clear-eyed determination. "You make a beautiful bride," Mrs. Walsh said softly, meeting Abigail's eyes in the mirror, "even under these unusual circumstances." "Thank you," Abigail replied, smoothing the fabric over her swollen belly, "though I hardly feel like a bride in the traditional sense." Mrs. Walsh's expression grew thoughtful. "Marriage takes many forms, my dear. Some begin with passionate love and grand ceremonies, others with practical considerations and quiet vows. What matters is not how you begin, but the commitment you make to one another before God." The wisdom in those simple words resonated deeply with Abigail. This was not the wedding she had dreamed of as a young girl, nor was Emmett the husband she had imagined for herself. Yet there was dignity in their arrangement, a mutual respect and clear-eyed purpose that might provide a stronger foundation than many matches based solely on fleeting emotion. By the time they returned to the church, Dr. Richardson and Mrs. Peterson had arrived. The doctor, a gruff man with gentle hands, greeted Abigail with professional courtesy. Peterson embraced her warmly, assuring her that the children were happily playing with her own brood. "Noah is teaching my Jacob to whittle just as Mr. Stone taught him," she reported with a smile, "and Emma has made fast friends with my Sarah. They're thick as thieves already." The news eased some of Abigail's anxiety about leaving the children even temporarily. Knowing they were safe and content allowed her to focus on the ceremony about to take place. Emmett stood waiting by the altar, his tall frame imposing even in the sacred space. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair combed back from his forehead. His clothes, the best he owned though, still plain and functional. When he turned and saw Abigail in the borrowed blue dress, something flickered in his gray eyes, surprise perhaps, or appreciation. Preacher Walsh took his position before the altar, Bible in hand. "Please join me," he invited, gesturing for Emmett and Abigail to stand before him. The ceremony itself was brief but solemn, the traditional words carrying weight despite the hastened circumstances. When Walsh asked for the ring, Emmett produced his mother's gold band, which already adorned Abigail's finger. "This was my mother's," he explained to the assembled witnesses. "She'd want Abigail to have it." The simple statement, offered without embellishment, touched Abigail more deeply than any flowery declaration might have. Here was honesty, respect for those who had gone before, and a sense of continuity that promised stability for the future. "By the authority vested in me, I see," Preacher Walsh declared at last, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss, neither of them had expected or suggested it, but Emmett did take Abigail's hand briefly in his, a silent acknowledgement of the covenant they had just entered into. The witnesses offered quiet congratulations, Dr. Richardson signing the marriage certificate with a flourish, while Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Practical matters were discussed. The doctor insisted on examining Abigail before they left town, concerned about her advanced pregnancy and the rigors of winter travel. "Everything seems to be progressing normally," he pronounced after a brief examination in a private room at the back of his small office. "But I'll plan to ride it out to check on you in a few weeks as your time approaches. First babies often come late, but with the stress you've experienced, we should be vigilant." Abigail thanked him, grateful for his matter-of-fact kindness. There had been no prying questions about the circumstances of her marriage, no judgment in his professional gaze, just practical concern for her well-being and that of her unborn child. By midday, the legal and medical matters had been addressed, and Emmett and Abigail, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Stone, prepared to collect the children and return to the ranch. They had just stepped out of the doctor's office when a voice called out from across the street, "Mrs. Morgan!" What a fortunate coincidence. Abigail froze her blood, turning to ice despite the winter sun overhead. The man approaching them walked with confident strides, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as an outsider in the frontier town. Tall and well-dressed with dark hair and a meticulously groomed mustache, He matched the description Peterson had given of Frederick Parker. A scar above his right eye completed the identification. Emmett moved slightly in front of Abigail, his posture subtly shifting from relaxed to alert. "Name's Stone now, hon," he corrected, his tone deceptively calm. "Mrs. Stone is my wife." Parker halted a few paces away, surprise flickering across his features, before he masked it with a polite smile. "Wife, my congratulations. This is unexpected news." "And you are," Emmett prompted, though Abigail knew he had already guessed the man's identity. "Frederick Parker, Western Pacific Railroad Company." He extended a hand that Emmett did not take. After an awkward moment, Parker withdrew, his smile tightening at the corners. "I've been looking for Mrs. Morgan, pardon me, Mrs. Stone, regarding some property her late husband owned. A matter of considerable value to all parties concerned." "Any business concerning my wife can be discussed with me present," Emmett stated flatly, "legal matters included." Parker's gaze shifted to Abigail, assessing her in a way that made her skin crawl, despite the layers of clothing between them. "Of course," he agreed smoothly. "I merely wish to inform the lady that her late husband's land holdings have become quite valuable. The railroad is prepared to make a very generous offer for the property rights." "Is that so?" Emmett's tone remained neutral, giving nothing away. "Specific figures would be helpful." Parker smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "I'd be happy to discuss details, perhaps over dinner at the hotel. My treat, of course, to celebrate your recent nuptials." The invitation was clearly a trap, an attempt to separate them from the safety of witnesses, to apply pressure in a controlled environment of Parker's choosing. Abigail placed a hand on Emmett's arm, a silent communication of her unease. "Another time, perhaps," Emmett declined. "We need to collect our children and return home before dark." At the mention of children, something predatory flickered in Parker's gaze. "Ah, yes, the little ones. I do hope they're well. Winter can be so hard on young children." The implied threat, however veiled, was unmistakable. Emmett's body tensed beneath Abigail's hand, though his expression remained impassive. "They're thriving," he said shortly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Mr. Parker, daylight's wasting." As they moved a step around him, Parker spoke again, his voice pitched low enough that only they could hear. "This hasty marriage won't protect what isn't rightfully yours, Mrs. Stone. Your husband's debts remain outstanding, and the railroad has legal claim to that land. One way or another, we will collect what is owed." Emmett turned back, his gray eyes cold as winter sky. "Threats against my family are unwise, Parker," he said quietly. "This territory has simple justice for men who endanger women and children." Parker raised his hands in a placating gesture, though his smile had vanished. "No threats, Mr. Stone, merely stating facts. Business is business, after all." "And family is family," Emmett countered. "Remember that." Without waiting for a response, he guided Abigail toward the sleigh, one hand protectively at the small of her back. She could feel Parker's eyes following them, calculating and cold until they rounded a corner and were out of sight. "He'll be trouble," Emmett said as he helped her into the sleigh. "Yes," Abigail agreed, her heart still racing from the encounter. "But what did he mean about the railroad having legal claim to Thomas's land? How could that be possible?" Emmett shook his head, taking up the reins. "Don't know, but I aim to find out. First, though, we get the children and head home. Need to secure the property before dark." They collected Noah and Emma from the Petersons, the children bubbling with stories of their new friends and the day's adventures. Emma noticed the blue dress immediately, her eyes widening with childish delight. "Mama, you look like a princess," she exclaimed, reaching out to touch the soft wool fabric. "Thank you, sweetheart," Abigail said, kneeling awkwardly to embrace her daughter despite her advanced pregnancy. "I have some news for you and Noah. Mr. Stone and I were married today. He's going to be your new father." Noah's expression grew serious, his young brow furrowing as he processed this information. "Does that mean we're staying here, not going to Tucson anymore?" "Yes," Abigail confirmed, watching his reaction carefully. "This will be our home now. Is that all right with you?" After a moment's consideration, Noah nodded solemnly. "Mr. Stone knows about hunting and trapping, and he's teaching me to whittle. I think he'll be a good father." The simple, practical assessment, so like Emmett's own straightforward manner, brought a lump to Abigail's throat. "I think so too," she managed. Emma, less concerned with the practical implications, clapped her hands in delight. "Does this mean I can call him Papa now?" Abigail glanced at Emmett, who had been quietly observing the exchange. His expression softened slightly at Emma's question. "If you'd like to," he said, his deep voice gentler than Abigail had ever heard it. "Papa." Emma repeated, testing the word with evident satisfaction. She held up her arms to Emmett, who after a moment's hesitation lifted her easily, settling her on his broad shoulder, where she perched like a delighted bird. Noah approached more cautiously, studying Emmett with solemn consideration. "Does this mean you'll protect us from bad men?" he asked, revealing that he had understood more about their precarious situation than Abigail had realized. Emmett met the boy's gaze directly, man to man, despite the difference in their ages. "With my life," he promised simply. The vow, spoken without dramatics, but with absolute conviction, seemed to satisfy Noah. He nodded once, then took his place beside the sleigh, ready for the journey home. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their trip into town had been, but the silence held a different quality. Not tension now, but a sort of mutual adjustment to their new reality. They were a family bound by law and promise, if not yet by deeper ties of affection. The knowledge settled over them like the blanket Emmett had tucked around Abigail and the children to ward off the winter chill. As they approached the ranch, however, Emmett's posture changed, tension returning to his broad shoulders. "Something's wrong," he said, slowing the horse. Abigail followed his gaze to the cabin in the distance. Nothing seemed obviously amiss, no smoke from a fire, no signs of disturbance visible from this distance. "What is it?" "Tracks," Emmett replied tersely. "Fresh ones leading to and from the cabin. Someone's been there while we were buying them." Fear clutched at Abigail's heart. "Parker." "Maybe." Emmett handed her the reins. "Take the children to the Peterson place. Stay there until I come for you." "No," Abigail said firmly, surprising herself with her own resolve. "We stayed together. All of us." Emmett's expression darkened. "Could be dangerous." "More dangerous to separate," Abigail countered. "If it is Parker, that's exactly what he wants, to divide us, make us vulnerable." For a moment, Emmett looked as if he might argue further. Then he nodded once, accepting her decision. "Stay in the sleigh with the children," he instructed. "I'll check the cabin first." As they drew closer, Abigail could see what had alerted Emmett, a set of horse tracks leading to and from the cabin, partially obscured by the day's light snowfall, but still clearly visible. The door of the cabin stood slightly ajar, another sign that someone had been there in their absence. Emmett brought the sleigh to a halt at a safe distance, then reached beneath the seat to retrieve a rifle Abigail hadn't realized was there. He checked it quickly, his movements efficient and practiced. "Stay here," he repeated, fixing her with a stern gaze. "Any sign of trouble, take the reins and head straight back to town. Preacher Walsh will help you." Before Abigail could respond, Emmett was moving toward the cabin, rifle at the ready, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. She gathered the children closer, one arm around each of them, whispering reassurances she didn't entirely feel. Emmett approached the cabin cautiously, using the corner of the structure as cover, before quickly crossing to the partially open door. With the rifle braced against his shoulder, he pushed the door wider with his boot, then disappeared inside. The minutes of his absence stretched like hours, each breath suspended in Abigail's throat as she strained to hear any sound from within the cabin. Noah and Emma huddled against her, sensing the tension, though she had tried to shield them from the worst of her fear. Finally, Emmett reappeared in the doorway, his expression grim, but his posture less tense. He gestured for them to approach. "It's safe," he called, "but they've been through everything." Relief at his safety mingled with fresh anxiety as Abigail helped the children down from the sleigh. What had the intruders been looking for? And had they found it? The interior of the cabin showed signs of a methodical search, drawers pulled open, their contents disturbed, the bedding in the small bedroom partially stripped. Emmett's storage chests opened and rifled through. Nothing appeared to be missing or destroyed, but the violation of their space was evident in every displaced item. They were looking for something specific, Emmett observed, surveying the disarray. Not random theft. The deed to Thomas's land, Abigail guessed, one hand protectively covering her rounded belly as the baby within shifted restlessly. "Parker must have come directly here after seeing us in town." Emmett nodded grimly. "Likely, but he won't have found it if it's still in that bank lockbox in Denver." He moved to the carved chest in the corner, Hannah's wedding gift from her father, which Abigail had noticed weeks ago but never opened. To her surprise, it stood undisturbed amid the chaos, its intricate lid still closed. They didn't touch this, she asked, puzzled. Hidden catch in the carving, Emmett explained, running his finger along a specific pattern in the wood. There was a soft click and a small drawer slid out from the side of the chest, a secret compartment invisible to casual inspection. From this hidden space, Emmett withdrew a folded document sealed with wax. Marriage certificate, he said, checking that it was undamaged before returning it to its hiding place. And now yours as well. They're safe. The practicality of his precautions struck Abigail anew. Even before today, Emmett had protected his most important documents from potential intruders, suggesting he had experience with such threats, or at least the foresight to anticipate them. We should report this to the sheriff, she suggested, beginning to straighten the disrupted bedding. Emmett's expression grew skeptical. Sheriff Jenkins spends most days in the saloon, he said, and he's known to be friendly with railroad interests. Don't expect much help from that quarter. The information was disheartening, but not entirely surprising. In frontier communities, law enforcement often aligned with powerful commercial interests rather than individual settlers. Then what do we do? Abigail asked, pausing in her efforts to restore order to their home. Parker clearly isn't going to simply accept our marriage and leave us in peace. We prepare, Emmett replied, his tone matter-of-fact. Secure the property, keep watch, and find out exactly what claim the railroad thinks it has on your late husband's land. He moved to help her with the bedding, his large hands surprisingly deft at smoothing the rumpled sheets. For tonight, though, we rest. Been a long day for all of us. Indeed, it had been, Abigail realized with a sudden wave of exhaustion. Morning had found her a widow considering an unusual proposition. Evening saw her a newlywed wife whose home had been invaded by unknown threats. The emotional toll of such transitions was beginning to make itself felt in a bone-deep weariness. Yes, she agreed, sinking onto a chair as her legs threatened to give way beneath her. Rest first, plans tomorrow. Emmett's gaze sharpened at her evident fatigue. You should lie down, he said, concern evident in his usually stoic expression. Children and I can manage the tidying. I'm fine. Abigail began to protest, but a sudden sharp pain in her lower back made her gasp, undermining her assertion. In an instant, Emmett was beside her, one large hand supporting her elbow. Abigail, he questioned, the use of her given name betraying his concern. Just tired, she assured him, though the pain had been more intense than mere fatigue would explain. And the baby is restless today. Emmett's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't press the matter. Bed rest, he said firmly. Doctor's orders before we left town, remember. It was true that Dr. Richardson had advised rest, particularly after the stress of the day. Abigail nodded, allowing Emmett to help her to the bedroom, where Noah and Emma were already attempting to restore order to the disrupted space. Mama needs to rest, Emmett told them, his tone gentle but authoritative. Let's finish this together and let her sleep a while. The children accepted this direction without argument, their earlier anxiety giving way to the practical task of setting things right. Abigail watched with a mixture of gratitude and wonder as her new husband and children worked together, straightening the room with careful efficiency. Thank you, she said softly as Emmett helped her into bed, still fully clothed, except for her boots, which he removed with unexpected tenderness. Rest, he repeated, drawing the covers up around her. I'll wake you for dinner. Exhaustion claimed her before she could respond, pulling her into a deep sleep filled with disjointed dreams, Parker's cold eyes watching her from shadows. Thomas's voice calling from a distance, warning of danger she couldn't identify. The feeling of being pursued through endless corridors of snow. She woke with a start to find the room in darkness, illuminated only by moonlight filtering through the small window. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was she? What time was it? Then memory returned: the wedding, Parker's threat, the violated cabin, her new husband's concern. Emmett, where was he now? And the children moving carefully to avoid waking the small forms she could just make out sleeping beside her. Abigail rose from the bed. Her back ached dully, a persistent discomfort she attributed to the day's stress and exertion. The main room was dimly lit by the dying fire, just enough light to navigate by. Emmett sat in a chair near the hearth, rifle across his knees, clearly standing watch despite the late hour. He looked up as she entered, instantly alert despite his evident fatigue. Everything all right? He asked quietly. Yes, Abigail assured him, moving to sit in the chair opposite his. Though I might ask you the same question. Have you slept at all? Emmett shook his head. Someone should keep watch, at least for tonight. The implication was clear. He expected Parker or his agents might return, perhaps hoping to catch them vulnerable in sleep. The thought sent a chill through Abigail despite the fire's lingering warmth. "You can't stay awake indefinitely," she pointed out. "We could take turns." A ghost of a smile touched Emmett's lips beneath his beard. "Done plenty of night watches in the war," he said. "Can manage fine on catnaps." It was a rare reference to his time as a soldier, a part of his past he seldom mentioned. Abigail found herself curious about that chapter of his life, what battles he had seen, what horrors he had witnessed, how those experiences had shaped the man he had become. "Which regiment were you with?" she asked, hoping the question wasn't too intrusive. Emmett's expression grew distant, his gaze fixed on some point in the past visible only to him. "7th Illinois Cavalry," he said after a moment. "Enlisted in '61 after Bull Run. Fought through to the end. 4 years of war years that had broken many men physically or spiritually or both. Yet Emmett had emerged whole enough to build a life afterward, to marry Hannah and Father Samuel, to create this homestead with his own hands." "Was it very terrible?" Abigail asked softly, knowing the question was inadequate, but unable to formulate a better one. "Parts of it," Emmett acknowledged, his voice low. "Other parts, there was brotherhood, purpose, clarity of right and wrong that civilian life often lacks." It was a more nuanced response than Abigail had expected, revealing a depth of reflection she was coming to recognize as characteristic of this outwardly taciturn man. Emmett Stone might speak rarely, but when he did, his words carried weight. "Is that when you received your scar?" she asked, gesturing to the jagged line that ran from his temple to his jaw. Emmett's hand went to the mark unconsciously. "Shiloh," he said simply. "Confederate saber. Came close to taking my eye." The casualness with which he referenced such a near-death experience spoke volumes about the life he had lived. Danger was not an abstraction, but a familiar companion, one he had learned to acknowledge without fear or drama. "I'm glad it didn't," Abigail said sincerely. Then, surprising herself with her own boldness, she added, "Though I imagine you were quite handsome before the war." Emmett's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly caught off guard by the personal nature of the observation. "Hannah never complained," he said after a moment, a hint of gruff humor in his tone. The reference to his first wife might have created awkwardness between them, but somehow it didn't. Instead, it felt like a bridge, an acknowledgement that both of them brought past to this new union, lives loved and lost that had shaped them into the people they now were. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Abigail said. "I wish I could have known her." "She would have liked you," Emmett replied, the words clearly costing him something to voice aloud. "She had no patience for pretense either." The assessment delivered with such straightforward certainty touched Abigail deeply. This was no empty platitude, but a genuine reflection, a point of connection between the woman she was and the woman who had once held Emmett's heart. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional pop and hiss of the dying fire. Abigail found herself studying her new husband's profile in the dim light, the strong line of his jaw beneath the neatly trimmed beard, the slight crook in his nose that had suggested it had been broken at some point, the deep-set eyes that had seen so much of both beauty and horror. "You should try to sleep again," Emmett said, eventually noticing her scrutiny. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." "As should you," Abigail countered. "At least for a few hours. I can keep watch until dawn." Emmett shook his head. "Not in your condition. Need your rest more than I do." The concern was genuine, but Abigail bristled slightly at being treated as fragile. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she reminded him. "Women have been bearing children while working fields and tending homes since the beginning of time." A faint smile ghosted across Emmett's features. "Stubborn," he observed, though the word held more admiration than criticism. "Like Hannah that way, too." Before Abigail could respond, a sharp pain seized her lower back, radiating around to her abdomen. She gasped, one hand clutching at the chair arm, while the other moved instinctively to her swollen belly. Emmett was beside her in an instant, rifle set aside, his expression alert with concern. "What is it?" "Nothing," Abigail tried to assure him, though her voice was strained. "Just the baby moving." But Emmett wasn't fooled. "That wasn't movement." He set his tone, leaving no room for argument. "How long have you been having pains?" Abigail hesitated, reluctant to cause alarm, but increasingly aware that something significant was happening within her body. "Since this afternoon," she admitted. but irregularly. It's too soon, the baby isn't due for weeks yet. Stress can bring labor early, Emmett said, surprising her with his knowledge. And you've had more than your share today. Another pain gripped her stronger than the last, forcing a small cry from her lips, despite her attempt to remain composed. This was no practice contraction. This was the real beginning of labor, a sensation she recognized from her previous births. The baby is coming, she gasped as the contraction eased. But it's too soon, and the doctor, he's in town. Emmett's expression remained calm, though his eyes betrayed his concern. Not the first birth I've attended, he said, his voice steady. Hannah trained as a midwife before we married, taught me what to watch for, what to do if no doctor was available. The revelation was unexpected but deeply reassuring. Frontier life had equipped many men and women with skills that would have been specialized professions in more settled communities. If Emmett had assisted at births before, they might manage this one without medical assistance. The children, Abigail said, another worry surfacing. They shouldn't see this. It might frighten them. Emmett nodded in understanding. Peterson Place is too far in your condition, he said, thinking aloud. But the barn has a small room warm enough with the livestock nearby. I could make them comfortable there until it's over. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it would serve for the emergency they now faced. Noah was old enough to help keep Emma calm, and they would be close enough for Emmett to check on regularly. Another contraction seized Abigail closer to the previous one than she had expected. Hurry, she urged through gritted teeth. They're coming faster now. Emmett moved with efficient and purpose, first helping Abigail to the bed, then waking the children with gentle but firm instructions. Noah, bleary-eyed but sensing the urgency of the situation, took charge of Emma with solemn responsibility. Your mama needs quiet for a while, Emmett explained, kneeling to their level. The baby is coming earlier than expected. I've made you a place in the barn where you'll be safe and warm. Noah, you're in charge of Emma until I come for you, Tictum. Can you be brave for your mama? The boy nodded, his young face set with determination. Yes, sir. That's good. Emmett approved, his hand briefly resting on Noah's shoulder. There's bread and cheese wrapped in the cloth there and a jug of water. If you need anything urgently, call out, but otherwise stay put until I come. Understand? Yes, sir. Noah repeated, already taking Emma's hand in his. We'll be good. Emmett bundled them into warm clothes, then led them quickly to the barn, returning minutes later with his arms full of clean linens and a kettle of water he set to heat on the stove. Not my first time at this, he reminded Abigail as another contraction racked her body. Hannah delivered half the babies in our settlement back in Illinois before we came west. The mention of Hannah in this context was oddly comforting, as if the skills Emmett had learned from his first wife were now a gift to his second, a connection across time and loss that might help bring new life safely into the world. The labor progressed with surprising speed, each contraction coming harder and closer than the last. Abigail, who had endured 2 previous births, was nonetheless unprepared for the intensity of this one, whether due to the premature timing, the stress of recent events, or simply the unique nature of each birth experience. Emmett proved as good as his word, attending her with calm efficiency that belied his size and usual taciturnity. His large hands, so capable of violence when needed, were gentle, as they supported her back during contractions, bathed her forehead with cool cloths, and eventually prepared to receive the child that was determined to enter the world regardless of circumstances. Almost there, he encouraged as Abigail bore down with all her strength, sweat dampening her hair despite the winter chill outside. Can see the head now. With one final monumental effort, Abigail pushed her child into the world, the sensation of release accompanied by Emmett's low exclamation of wonder. A girl, he announced, his voice rougher than usual with suppressed emotion. Small but breathing strong. He placed the infant on Abigail's chest, still attached to the cord that had sustained her these many months. The baby's cry was thin but vigorous, her tiny fists clenched in protest at her abrupt transition into the cold, bright world. Hello, little one, Abigail whispered, tears streaming unchecked down her face as she cradled the new life against her heart. You're early, but you're here. Emmett busied himself with the practical necessities, tying and cutting the cord, delivering the afterbirth, cleaning and swaddling the infant with a gentleness that belied his size. Only when these tasks were complete did he pause, looking down at mother and child with an expression Abigail couldn't quite decipher. She's beautiful, he said simply. Perfect. The words unadorned but heartfelt touched something deep in Abigail's exhausted soul. This child conceived with Thomas, but born into Emmett's care, represented both an ending and a beginning, a bridge between past and future. Would you like to hold her? She offered, understanding instinctively that this moment was significant for them both, a first step toward truly becoming the family they had legally become that morning. Hesitantly, as if afraid his large hands might somehow damage the tiny bundle, Emmett reached for the infant. He cradled her with exquisite care, his expression softening as he gazed down at the new life in his arms. "What will you name her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Abigail had considered many names during her pregnancy, but in this moment only one seemed fitting. Faith, she said, the word carrying layers of meaning beyond the simple virtue it represented. Faith in the future, in new beginnings, in the possibility of healing after loss. Emmett nodded as if the name resonated with something in his own heart. "Faith," he repeated softly. "It suits her." As if recognizing her name, the infant opened her eyes dark blue, like all newborns, but likely to lighten with time. She gazed up at Emmett with the unfocused intensity of the newly born, one tiny hand escaping the swaddling to wave in the air between them. Without hesitation, Emmett offered his finger, which the baby grasped with surprising strength. The connection, so simple, yet so profound, seemed to move him deeply. For a moment, the stoic mask he usually wore slipped, revealing raw emotion beneath wonder, tenderness, and something that might have been the first stirrings of paternal love. "She has a good grip," he observed, his voice rough with feeling. "Strong, despite coming early." "Like her namesake," Abigail said softly. "Small, but powerful." The moment was interrupted by a small sound from the doorway, which made Noah peering cautiously into the room with Emma peeking around him. "The baby came?" Noah asked, his voice hushed with awe. Emmett turned to face them, still cradling Faith in his arms. "Yes," he confirmed. "You have a sister. Her name is Faith." Emma slipped past her brother, approaching Emmett with uncharacteristic caution. "Can I see?" she whispered. Emmett knelt carefully, bringing the infant to the children's eye level. "This is Faith," he introduced. "Your new sister." The wonder on the children's faces as they beheld their tiny sibling was a balm to Abigail's heart, easing fears she had scarcely acknowledged even to herself, that they might resent this new addition, that they might struggle to accept Emmett as a father figure, that their small family might fracture under the weight of so much change. Instead, she saw in their expressions the natural resilience of childhood, the capacity to embrace new circumstances with open hearts. Noah reached out tentatively to touch Faith's downy head, his expression solemn with newfound responsibility as an elder brother. Emma, less restrained, pressed a gentle kiss to the baby's forehead. "She's so tiny," she marveled. "Was I that small, Mama?" "Just about," Abigail confirmed, smiling despite her exhaustion. "You were a bit bigger, but not much." The children's acceptance of their new sister extended naturally to Emmett as well. When he carefully returned Faith to Abigail's arms, Noah addressed him directly for the first time as Papa, an acknowledgement of their new relationship that clearly moved Emmett deeply. "Can we stay with Mama and Faith now?" Emma asked, already climbing onto the bed beside Abigail. Emmett glanced at Abigail, silently deferring to her judgment about whether she needed more rest before accommodating the children's curiosity. She nodded, shifting slightly to make room for both children on the bed. "For a little while," she agreed, "but Mama is very tired, so you must be very gentle and quiet." The children settled on either side of her, their small bodies warm against hers as they gazed in fascination at their new sister. Emmett remained standing nearby, his presence solid and reassuring in the aftermath of the burst's intensity. In that moment, despite the threats that still loomed outside their door, Parker with his mysterious claims, the railroad with its powerful interests, the harsh frontier winter with its unforgiving demands, Abigail felt a profound sense of rightness. This unlikely family, forged from necessity, but already showing signs of genuine connection, might yet find not just survival, but happiness in their union. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, casting pale gold light through the cabin's small windows, Abigail looked up at Emmett. Their gazes met in silent communication, acknowledgement of what they had endured together in the span of a single day and what might yet lie ahead. "You should rest now," Emmett said softly. "All of you. I'll keep watch." The promise encompassed more than just the immediate moment. It was a vow of protection, of provision, of presence, through whatever challenges the future might hold. Abigail recognized it for what it was, not just the duty of a husband, but the commitment of a man who had chosen against all odds to open his heart once more to the possibility of family. "Thank you," she whispered, the simple words carrying depths of meaning beyond their syllables. Emmett nodded, once understanding without need for elaboration. Then he moved to the window, rifle in hand, positioning himself where he could observe both the approach to the cabin and the sleeping family within. As sleep claimed Abigail once more, her last conscious thought was of the strange journey that had brought them to this moment: a broken wagon wheel in a blizzard, a proposal born of pragmatism, a wedding hastened by threat, a birth arriving earlier than expected. None of it had unfolded according to plan or expectation, yet somehow it had led to this, a new beginning, for four wounded souls bound together by choice and circumstance into something that might, with time and care, grow into love. Outside, the sun rose fully over the snow-covered landscape, its light transforming the ordinary scene into something beautiful, despite its harshness. Inside, Emmett Stone stood watch over his newly formed family, his scarred face softened by a tenderness few had ever witnessed, his gray eyes alert but peaceful as he guarded what had so unexpectedly become his to protect. Faith slept in her mother's arms, her tiny features relaxed in the perfect trust of the newly born. Noah and Emma slumbered on either side of Abigail, their young faces free for once of the worry that had marked them since their father's death. And Abigail herself rested more deeply than she had in months, held in the safety of a home that had found her when she needed it most. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Parker's threats, the railroad's claims, the harsh realities of frontier life, they would face them not as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but as a family bound by choice, commitment, and the first fragile tendrils of genuine affection. In this moment of quiet dawn, that knowledge was enough.